Hey guys, welcome back to another interview episode of Metal Forge Reviews, where we speak with Shane Ryan, the bass player of the bludgeoning death doom band Atavist. If you love your doom, epic as completely drowned in crushing intensity, this band is one of the best. Reformed in 2016/17 after a 10-year long hiatus, the UK-born death doom band Atavist have returned in 2020 with the brand new studio album 3 Absolution, out now on Candlelight Records. The third full-length album from the band is here after 13 years following their highly acclaimed 2007 record 2, Ruined, which came out on Profound Lore/Invada Records. 3 Absolution is a absolute monster of a record for those who love their metal tuned low, played very slow, super atmospheric, and just crushing vibes. The record is made up of 4 massive tracks that pummel the listener with emotive and atmospheric death doom metal that completely had me hooked. I mean, this is just everything that is amazing doom metal. I love anything sorrowful and just dismal and terrible, and this made me feel all those feelings. So it is a perfect doom record in that regard. This record quickly became an Album of the Year list contender for Ben and I, and it also made it on our top metal albums of 2020 so far list, which we'll link in the description. We talk about the history of the band and how Shane and Chris Naughton of the UK black metal band Winterfelleth, so awesome, composed the music, all of their studio experiences, gear that they use, and more. Stay tuned, enjoy the episode, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more metal interview content, reviews, top lists, and reactions. Enjoy the show.
Welcome into another interview segment. We are very delighted to be hosting Shane Ryan, the bassist of Atavist, on today's program. Shane, thank you for joining us today. We'd like to learn a little bit about you. Could you tell us how you got into the music scene in the UK and how you eventually ended up with Atavist?
Yeah, okay. How far do I want to go back? So
as far back as you want.
Atavist was the first band I did that I formed with Chris, the guitarist. Chris had done some bands before, and we had met through a guy I knew who ran an independent music store in Manchester. It was called Roadkill Records. This is a while ago now. And I think Chris was asking around for other people who might be into doom or slow music. So my name got mentioned, we met up, and the early days of jamming was sitting on his couch listening to very long records, which also kind of led to the first track we wrote. But before then, kind of a number of accidents, I guess, of just speaking to people, meeting people. When I first got into metal was in art class in high school, when somebody next to me said, "Here, listen to this." And that was, I don't know, 15, 16. And that was the first Slipknot record. I think that was around that time. And then quickly bounced through that. So I'm a big fan of kind of extreme horror and action cinema. So Hong Kong films, I grew up a lot of that stuff. A lot of horror films, Italian horror films, weird stuff. So I've always been drawn to kind of, I guess, the extreme side of certain types of art. And as soon as I heard that, it was, okay, what's next? And what's next? And what's next? And then I bumped into some people in the town I grew up in, and within a space of 2 years, that had led to people lending me CDs by things like Creationist Crucifixion, which is like an old grindcore band, Brutal Truth, a bunch of other stuff. And then around that time, there was the early days, I guess, of stuff like PayPal and eBay. And you could go through stuff like geostatus websites and just people, I guess that's kind of like the early days of blogs. And people would write stuff, and that's what I came across to see an album by a band called Grief called Come to Grief, and the artwork of that immediately was like, right, what is this? And I remember ordering it. Again, you couldn't listen to anything, you just had to order it, put your money in, it turned up a few weeks later because it was the postal service from America, and then hearing that and thinking, I don't even know where the riffs begin and end, because it was so alien, the concept of slow music to me, that now I listen to it, it just sounds perfectly normal, but back then it was really difficult. And then I was hooked. And it's like, what's next? What's next? And I ended up ordering an album by a band called Corrupted, and then from then on, that was it. I was in for really slow music.
So you kind of definitely fell down the rabbit hole of doom, it sounds like.
Yes, around that time. So that would have been, what was that? Even 99, yeah, I played around 2000, going through to about 2005, buying a lot of CDs and just, sometimes it'd be split 7 inches, because they used to be a lot cheaper than they are now. So they were like a really good way to, I've heard that band, you buy it and you play the other side. If you like it, you then go buy their album. You kind of bounced through these 7 inches. But that was when they were a lot cheaper, so it made sense to do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you touched on it a little bit, so we'd like you to kind of extrapolate a bit. Some bands like to get loud in a rehearsal room and jam on riffs, while others utilize technology and send tracks, to other band members. So we're very curious about the writing process that you and the guys in Atavist prefer, and maybe kind of go through the history of it, because I'm sure it's changed over time. And could you also touch on the orchestral and the keyboard parts in Absolution and how those were incorporated into the songs?
Yeah, so very early days for the first record was mainly me, especially the first song was me and Chris jamming in his room, just with like practice amps. And that's where we had this idea of what happens if we created, just how far could we go with a song? So we're just going to play this riff, and then the rule is we can't repeat a riff. And just how far can we get? And that's where 3138 came from, because that's how long the song lasted for. When we recorded it, sometimes we played parts longer or shorter live, so it never was actually that length all the time, just when we recorded it. And then we took that and started jamming with somebody that Chris had met through a forum at the time. I think it was a Southern Lord forum. And that was a drummer from Burning Witch who lived about an hour's drive away at the time. So we ended up jamming with him. And that really, the song changed quite a bit during that time, just again, the natural progression of jamming. And then Toby, the vocalist, came in, and again, it progressed again. And from that point onwards, and including the second album, it was jamming a lot, of turning it up, jamming it over and over and over again, and just getting a feel for how long stuff should be, should it change, should it not, where should it go next. Sometimes it was accidental, sometimes it was planned. That sort of jamming process happened a lot more. And then there's been about, I don't know, at least a 13-year gap. So things have moved on a bit since then, tech-wise. And Chris has his own setup that allows him to demo in his room, a lot of tracks. So we jammed a few times on this record when we did, but a lot more of it was written with this idea of layering all the time. We already had a concept before we started writing anything, and we wanted to be more intentional all the time and get into this feedback loop, very similar to what you just said, of play with an idea, record it, listen back to it, adapt. So it's like this continual cycle over and over and over again. So every time we'd sit down and write some more, we'd go away, listen to it, come back, right, what needs to change? That's too long, that should do short, that just doesn't work, that's too cheesy, that's too this, that's too that, take it out, change it. And we iterated a lot more through that process, which also meant we essentially had it demoed, because we could take it into the studio then and then do it properly from then on. And that's where we demoed some of the additional guest music, but a lot of it really came to life in the studio, where we'd had done delaying parts written, and that's kind of what we'd call an enabling constraint. So here's the constraint within these notes, within this sound, within this feel, go for it. So they then create their own stuff over the top of that would fit. But it wasn't a case of just write something brand new. It was, okay, but here's how it's got to fit. This is how it's got to be. Let's go for it. Let's do a few takes and just see what naturally occurs. So it required a lot of trust to do that, but I think it came out quite nice. And in regards to the second album, we tried some elements of that, but I guess we didn't have both the knowledge and skills to quite pull it off. So on the second parts, second album, we had the idea that you could play it as one, and there's all these bridge tracks that would play, and we have things like piano, guest vocals, like experimental noise vocals, other things that were going on. But again, within the studio, a lot of that was happy accidents and other things happening during the period we had, because pretty much that whole album was recorded live for the most part, the second one, in the studio. Whereas this time, again, it was more intentional. And then we thought, right, let's bring these people in. This part needs this sort of sound. Chris said, well, I've worked with this person before. They'd be perfect. Let's bring them in if they're willing to do it. And those parts started to come together.
Awesome. That's a great explanation.
Part of what I love what you were talking about there is it seems like you had a almost orchestral process in terms of how you guys build the songs. You guys have layers. You have the same riffs repeating over and over again, and then there's a change. And that sort of gets into our next question, which is the recording for 3 Absolution. It took place at Skyhammer Studio with Chris Fielding, big fan. For those who aren't aware, Chris also is the bass player in the UK doom band Conan, and has recorded some legendary bands from the UK, including Fen, Winterfilleth, Electric Wizard, among others. Absolution has some amazing sonic qualities. Can you tell us a little bit about the recording process and what it was like working with Chris at the studio?
Yes, working with Chris was different to a lot of what I'd experienced before. Tying into what's something earlier, actually, with the guest musicians, the process required a lot of trust. And that's because as we're recording things, we're layering. And when we're layering, often, well, everything's completely unmixed. And it can sound, sometimes we think, is this sounding right? Is that guitar actually heavy enough? And it's only because you're hearing one of, 6, 7, 8 different parts. And so it takes a while for these things to start layering up. What's really good working with Chris as well was he has a really good ear for when things are off slightly that maybe you can't capture, especially when you're playing the music. Maybe you're too close, as it were, and you're missing something. And you might say, actually, there's something not right there. And just his ability to also just give the most honest feedback all the time, completely objective. That could be like that. This could be like that. Let's replay that. Let's do 3 takes of it, and let me show you how this could be. Let's do these parts. So even in the recording process, it was really quick feedback all the time. And then again, whatever was done that day, bounce that back down. Let's listen to it, even in its really raw, very minimal mixing. And let's go through that process again and again and again. I think it was about 10 days in total, but they were broken up over weekends, different days. So it's like guitars, bass, then it was drums, and then vocals, and then the guest musicians. That's what memory tells me was the process. And they were broken up over a period of time with us maybe asking questions and thinking about the mix as we went.
That's awesome. I mean, it's cool that you guys had that because the producer he's the secret member of the band, and you need that objective feedback as you're constructing a record, because when you're in it and you're constantly listening back and getting the same thing over and over and over again, it's hard to take a step back. You need that critical ear, and that's awesome that you guys had that on this record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Next question I have here is, the cross between death and doom metal has strong roots in the UK, and I'm not complaining because some of my favorite bands came from there. Bands like Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, Anathema, just to name a few. Can you tell us some of your personal influences and what bands or albums inspire you when you're playing with Atavist?
Sure. My answer could be very different if you asked other members of the band. They may mention some of the bands you just said, but I wouldn't. So if I think particularly about this record, so with Doom especially, this record came out really made me think about when the last time it was that I really listened to a lot of Doom bands, and it has been a while. I think I've been quite stuck with some of those bands I mentioned earlier. So when I think about a recent funeral Doom record, I think of Tides of Awakening by Tyranny. I don't know how old that is, 10, 15 years old. It's not new. A lot of the Corrupted stuff from Passo Inferior, Amundo Frio, those things still stand with me. Those records stand up so well. Passo Inferior might even be nearly 20 years old now, and it's still incredibly heavy. It's ridiculously heavy. How they just the sonics and everything they use and how they've recorded as a band, which is way ahead of its time. It's incredible. I listen to other stuff as well, some electronic stuff that will inspire some stuff. Things such as Stars of the Lid and Tim Hecker, which kind of inspire this idea. I really enjoy tone a lot. So in the writing process, Chris is much more skilled a musician, than I am. So when we jam, I'll be trying to hear for what the tone should be, and then we'll have a conversation about what. So I'm trying to explain to him the sound of something, like maybe this should go up a bit here. I don't know what that means, but there's a tone here where it should flow. It should feel like it moves into that. So that affects the process a lot. Death metal wise, there's some really good stuff going on at Portal, for example. If I think going back to one of the earlier parts, we just talked about taking that idea and extreme art idea, and you're kind of always trying to take it further and further and further. In some ways that can go really badly. In other ways it becomes more experimental and you hear things you wouldn't expect. So yeah, Portal is definitely a really good example of, again, there's just like this idea of this swirling, horrific. Sometimes people use the idea of cosmic because it's just so broad. And again, I guess for some people that haven't heard us before, if you listen to Portal, you'd have no idea where one riff starts and one riff ends. I'm sure that's the case for most people still, but I really love that stuff. And some of the more really simplistic but brutal elements of metal, this kind of genre, kind of war metal stuff, we get Revenge and Conqueror, where it's just this really aggressive but simplistic sound that was almost, I feel like it was almost born from grindcore, but then they went, okay, once they strip out all the kind of jokey or silly elements and just go really all in into like 5 minute, just endless blast, and that's what you can hear. So a lot of those things, yeah, influence me. Lots of different bits and pieces, but for me, it's always the tone. Like often when I put a record on, within 5-10 seconds, I know if I'm going to sit with it or not. And it's just this, I can't quite explain it, but it's always this tone or sound that attracts me on albums.
That's really cool that you say that, because it's almost like you're getting to the root of why. It's almost like a primal feeling of why you will have a record, you know, and tone is really, it's such a abstract thing to think about, and you know what you want to hear. And that's really cool that you guys approach it that way.
The designs for your album covers are really powerful and convey a sense of foreboding and dread, especially the album cover for Absolution, which features a silhouette in a field, and it's the perfect visual companion for the music. Can you tell us about how the band uses visual components to help reinforce the lyrical themes and the atmosphere?
I was having a conversation recently about this, and I'm trying to catch myself whether I'm creating a story of what I think it should be now, and I'll explain why I think that this is what it was. And the more I think about Absolution as an album now, the more it becomes clear to me that it is purely about the individual. That's absolutely key. And if I think back through what we've done as a band, there's always been, even to the early days where it was more about attitude and belligerence and volume, it was still about the individual, always. And I don't believe that's initially where the concept for the artwork came from. However, it must have been with us when we were writing this stuff, and the conversations we're having, and this concept of, we had this idea of a shape, and then we named it Absolution because that's kind of the best fitting word for the shape we had of how the whole record should sound. But we started working, but now I look back, every image has an individual working in it. But I can't remember us saying that it should, but at some point it did. And again, it's one of these things where I think the concept, as we just talked about it so much, that it started to infect a lot of the other conversations we're having, even with, we didn't direct the artwork, we've discovered this artist or photographist, and we thought, okay, there's something here that matches, again, the sound. There's a lot of this kind of like black and white or sepia kind of washed look to some stuff, and a lot of the times it was a faceless person where you couldn't quite see, or there's maybe a double meaning, or you'd always infer your own thing. There's a lot of space, I think I want to say, yes, a lot of space in imagery, and it just matched perfectly to when we started actually, especially when we started putting the layout together. There was 3 different images of the individual. So there's the one that's kind of from behind with the bird going over. There's my personal favorite, which is one that's kind of more distance, where that's the idea of walking. And then there's the individual on the bridge as well. So those things, bonded really well. And on the previous album, Ruined, those were photos taken from, it might have been an old abandoned asylum or hospital in the northwest of England. And those photos were taken from within that. And the concept of Ruined was that kind of, again, almost the self-destruction of the individual, or somebody that had already self-destructed and was existing in that state, whether that was, for whatever means, whether that was physical degradation that started affecting the mind, although really the mind doesn't really exist, it's still a physical brain. But obviously, the more the alcohol, drugs, or misbehavior starts to affect your brain, then that starts to make you feel a certain way, and then it all feeds back into itself. It's like a negative feedback loop. This idea of just ruining yourself, but you're stuck in it. And that was again a loose feel that's just probably played more of a nihilistic mindset at the time of why that looks the way it does. Whereas in this record, you can, from conversations with people, it appears that there's been a clear change, and that was intentional, where there was supposed to be some form of something that maybe made a step up or a slight peak. Trying to draw the shape of a hand now because we drew it. It was kind of like a slightly bent U shape, this idea where it would start somewhere, something would happen, it would dip down, and it would kind of slightly raise. It wouldn't be like, you're not at the top of, the idea is you're not at the top of the mountain, it's not a big victory, but there's something, this idea of the possibility of absolution.
That's really cool how you went from sort of an abstract idea into something that, finally came out to be what the album artwork was. Was that more so, did you work with the photographer with that idea, or did you say, hey, this is, did you give him more of a concrete thing, or did you give him that kind of abstract visual?
One of the 3 images, there was another version originally of that. And when we'd once we'd spoken to her, we had this idea of it's something like this, and this is the idea. And we may even send some of the demo material that we had at the time that me and Chris recorded. I think we had to say this is what it's going to sonically sound like. So again, talking about the idea of here's your constraint, almost like here's the sandbox we'd like you to operate in, and then just go for it and see what happens. Again, it's this level of trust there.
Yeah, that's a huge level of trust, and I feel that when we speak with bands who work with the person who's designing the visual elements, when they work with them so closely, when they show them the music that their art is going to be representing, it's so cohesive, and it's really, you can just tell how much more power the visual element, whether it's the promo photos or the album artwork or whatever, how much more cohesion there is with the sonic elements. And I love the cohesion that Absolution has. The album cover is just so perfect. It is the perfect representation for what the listener is about to get into. So, moving on, let's talk a little bit about Candlelight Records. The band is currently signed to Candlelight Records, and they are an outstanding metal label that has a spectacular roster of bands. Can you tell us about how the band got signed to Candlelight and what it's been like working with them with the release of Absolution?
Sure. A simple one, and that is Chris being in Winterfire made it a quicker connection. So for Chris was able to say, oh, we're going to do this again. And who he was speaking to at Candlelight said, oh yeah, I remember that stuff. I really want to hear it. So there'd been 2 parts there. One is we had done some stuff a long time ago, and then was that connection there. So it was thankfully an easy conversation to have. And once we started again creating that early demo material, which was another benefit to it, is we could share some of that early stuff and say, okay, here's what it sounds like when it's just done with no real professionalism through Chris's PC. Here's a baseline of it. And even then, bit of a side note, when we were demoing that, we thought we wanted it to be where it would be good enough even just like that. So we really wanted to go over it over and over again, knowing that when we took that to studio, everything would just be dialed up from then on. So the Candlelight was really, really simple. They allowed us, again, with it, we picked the artist. We then worked with somebody to put the actual layout and everything together. We got into conversation about, well, what color of vinyl do we have? Well, what makes sense for the artwork? Because if you pull out, do you want it to be a distraction? Hence, we went for the clear because we felt it just matched the artwork again. So we got a lot of, complete control in that environment. Who we recorded with, all those things. It's been smooth.
Awesome.
One of our viewers, Matt Davis, shout out to Matt Davis. He's been following the channel since the start. You got to shout out the fans. thought it would be great to hear one of our recent guests talk about their bass rig or just equipment in general. So we'll pose that same question to you. What is your go-to setup for a live playing rig or even recording?
It's going to be a 5-string bass, nothing in particular for me, because we down tune to A, thicker strings to hold that resonance. So otherwise, everything just, your tuning is going to go pretty immediately. Play a few notes and the tuning will go. The bass I have, which I can't remember the name of, it's quite old now, fortunately holds that quite well. Otherwise, you have to get that, often you have to take that in and get work done on the bridge of other things, because again, it will hold those notes or they'll bleed together. And as a bassist, the only pedal I use is a rat pedal distortion. And that does everything you'll need distortion-wise when it comes to a bass. But the rat pedal was, even from the first record, that's still the same pedal I use. It's holding out, battery powered as well, so one day it'll go. But that's the main thing I use to get that sound.
That's awesome. I mean, it's so cool to get the insider look on the gear stuff, because everybody has their own go-to thing. And it sounds like yours goes back quite a long ways in history. And the fact that you keep that through all of your releases and on this record too, it's kind of a cool testament to the fact that you guys are picking it up so many years later and it's still working for you, you know?
I think we came to the rat pedal because Chris used to use one as well on the intro records. He doesn't use it now. He uses different gear. But again, from memory, it's been a while. I feel like this came from early days of when bands like Sun, using Sun amps. And I want to say that there was rat pedals involved at some point as well. I can't remember if that's true. That's just me trying to think back to where did we... I even get the feeling that my rat pedals might be Russian or something. There's just these metal boxes with 3 dials on them, and it does the job very well.
That's awesome. And I mean, it kind of gets into our next question. That's not really a gear question, but it's more related to how, people consume music. And being a band that started so long ago and you're continuing now, there's this conversation of physical versus digital, and you've got diehard fans who kind of do both. I kind of want to get into a conversation of, how do you prefer to listen to music? Like, are you a collector, physical? Do you do streaming? How do you consume?
There's how I prefer, and then there's how I usually do. So how I usually do is free streaming services, and that's mainly it's just for ease more than anything. And earlier we talked about 7 inches were a way I'd find out about bands before a lot of this other things would occur, and they used to be like €2-3 a piece. Shipping used to be a lot cheaper. About 15 years ago, maybe it sounds obvious, but it was a lot cheaper, which enabled you to find stuff that way. Whereas even the price of shipping records now is sometimes more than a record itself, which prohibits that just picking up a few random records. It just doesn't make as much sense. So streaming helps to find other things, but nothing for me will ever beat the ritual of putting vinyl on. So socially, for me, being with other people it's vinyl. Opening up the vinyl, playing both sides. There is a beautiful thing about vinyl that you can't fast forward without getting up in an easy way. So I find a lot of people in streaming services will play half a song and skip, or play a song and move on. With vinyl, you often get hooked into the whole record a lot easier, and I think that's just part of the physical ritual of putting something on. So for me, I've actually downsized my vinyl collection quite a bit over the years, but what it's become is this idea that every single record's great. So I could just close my eyes and just pull anything out, and it would just be there. I'll listen to that. I'm not gonna put it back in. And in some ways, that also helps, because I don't know if there's a term for it, but when you have too many options, it's harder to just make a decision. It's almost like there's too much noise, so it kind of gets confusing. But yeah, for me, the vinyl, me and Chris, it's one of our, I guess, as friends' favorite things to do is just sit down and just go through and just pick out records and talk and drink until the early hours. And just go through back catalogues of bands. Often that's what happens. Find a band and then start working backwards.
That's really cool that you guys do that. And, it's funny, like, there's this resurgence, almost like Renaissance era of this stuff coming back. Like, everybody wants to collect vinyl now. And there's a certain respect for a band that wants to pursue the record, the actual full-blown, no shits given, start to finish, write an artistic piece. And that needs to be appreciated. And I love that you guys came up with the full circle interpretation of not only the artwork, but from start to finish, an absolutely killer record that deserves to be on vinyl.
Shane, are there any shout-outs that you would like to give, maybe to some of your pals or fellow bands in the scene who might be watching right now as we wrap things up here?
I guess just additional thanks to, we've received some, actually, I won't call it names, we've received some messages from some people in regards to the record itself, where people, this wasn't expected, but some people have been quite open about certain things, or how they've seen the record as a loop or a journey, and it's made them consider something or think about something. It was not in a way we expect people to react. So I would just say, I guess just thanks to, I guess, people to have the courage to say some of the things that have been said. I'm not going to say any more than that, but yeah, I would like to call that out, if anything.
That's fantastic. I think that it's great when a band is very receptive, when they put out a piece, as Atavist has done, that is obviously very rooted in introspection, that is very rooted in the human condition, is very rooted in emotion. That can spark with somebody. That can maybe get them through a difficult time. Maybe it can help them to find the courage to do something that they, have been struggling with or whatever. So I think it's awesome when a band is able to be receptive to that and to be in communication with their audience and allow that to be kind of a back and forth and not just here you are, the band out on the pedestal, and you're the audience and you're the fans. So that's fantastic. I think it's well deserved. It is, as Brandon said, it is a contender of album of the year for us. We love this type of music, and just thank you for releasing such a fantastic album.
Yeah, it's no problem. That's what we try to do. Thank you.
Yeah, keep up the great work. So thank you to Shane Ryan of the droning doom death metal band Atavist for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you, our viewers, for your attention. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more interviews and discussions with great metal bands. Support Atavist by going to their Bandcamp or to the Candlelight Records web store. Their latest album, 3, Absolution, just came out and is already a top contender of Album of the Year list for us here at Metal Forge Reviews. If you want to see other albums on that list, make sure to go back and watch our top metal albums of 2020 so far. Be safe, be cool this summer, and be kind to each other. Take care.